This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Rosanna Keefe from the University of Sheffield, who's going to talk to us about validity, normativity and degrees of belief.
Thanks very much for inviting me. So, the general background question here is, what is it for an argument to be valid? So, supposing we're not assuming classical logic is correct, all sorts of possibilities open up. Several characterizations of validity that coincide classically no longer coincide. So is validity necessary preservation of truth, or is it what we often teach our students, not possible to have all premises true and conclusion false? Because these will come apart if we can have sentences that aren't true but aren't false either. And if we introduce all sorts of other mechanisms, maybe degrees of truth, there become various different ways of characterizing validity, all of which have some claim to generalizing classical notion. So I'm wondering what it is for an argument to be valid, how we should go about deciding among different conceptions of validity, maybe among different choices of alternative logics. And the proposal I'm interested in this talk is whether we can get a grip on validity by thinking of the normative role of valid arguments. A notable feature of validity is that assessing an argument as valid or not valid is often taken to have a normative information to how we should reason. Can we take that feature of valid arguments and use it to illuminate what's meant by validity and what arguments are valid, maybe to illuminate the choice between alternatives? I'm going to be arguing that doesn't work, that we can't, but I'm going to be looking at suggestions along those lines, and in particular looking at some principles from Hartree-Field, talking about his work. First I want to say a little bit about why we should question or maybe reject the simple equation of validity with necessary truth preservation. So first of all, I'm motivated by the situation where there are indeterminately true sentences, maybe due to vagueness or other phenomena. We could still say that validity is necessary for the preservation of complete truth, and then not worry about having premises that are just slightly less than true, and conclusion that's false. You could allow for that with a valid argument, as long as whenever you've got completely true premises, you get completely true conclusion. But it's not obvious to me that that's the way we should go. We might want the classification of validity to affect what we know about our conclusion, given the premises that are not completely true. Similarly, we might want illumination over sentences that are where we have intermediate degrees of truth through to uncertainty. Should there be limits on what kind of degree of belief we should have in a conclusion, given degrees of belief in premises of a valid argument? So that's one kind of reason to question whether it is necessary for preservation. The second one that Hartree-Field talks about a lot, he argues that in the light of the semantic paradoxes, we can't simply equate validity with necessary truth preservation. And a third kind of reason is that we might want logic of arguments involving maybe imperatives or other sentences that aren't eligible for truth. So should we appeal to the normative features of validity? Of course, if we're going to do that, we've got to get much clearer on what the normative import is of calling an argument valid. One kind of normative import you might think there is, I want to say isn't enough, won't be enough. So different logics give you different rules. Maybe you should think, well, each logic tells you how you should reason according to that logic, what's correct reason as far as that logic's concerned. But that kind of line won't do to help us illuminate validity, because on that kind of line you can talk about how we should reason according to some weird and wonderful logic that doesn't have any chance of being the right logic. So if we're going to illuminate validity through normativity, we want to have a better grasp of the normative. We don't just want it to be relative to the logic. I'm going to take as a starting point John Broome's account of reasoning in terms of normative requirements. So he says, if one proposition follows from this, then believing that proposition is normatively required by believing the others. Where the idea of a normative requirement, P is a normative requirement for Q. It ought to be the case that if P, so we get something like BP on the handout, if A and B entails C, then you ought to see to it that if you believe A and you believe B, you believe C. Okay. Now that's compatible with your responding to a valid argument from two things you believe A and B, a valid argument from those to C. You don't want to accept C. Well, you're not obliged to accept C. Of course, you can go back and reject one of your beliefs, either A or B or both. But there is a requirement that you see to it that you don't believe A and B without believing C, according to this principle. Now, I don't want there are various things we could worry about with this principle, and because I'm going to be moving on to thinking about degrees of belief in relation to this, I'm not going to go into all the modifications we might want to make. I just want to talk about one, which is that it looks like this principle would require us to believe all the consequences of our beliefs. I mean, as I say, you can give up one of your beliefs because of the consequences, but it looks like you've got to decide one way or another in light of all logical consequences. And of course, you can have some logical consequences that follow from some of your beliefs by some complex argumentation. You may not notice that they follow. Are you really to blame? Not the doctrine beliefs that it follows. A response to this might be to qualify BP and say that the normative requirement only holds if maybe the subject knows that C follows from A and B, or maybe if it's obvious that C follows from A and B. Field talks about how it uses that kind of obviousness condition. Well, there are various other alternatives available. Another thing we might bear in mind is it that if you got to see to it that if you believe A and you believe C, then you believe, you believe A and you believe B, then you believe C, or is it enough that to make sure you don't, if you believe A and you believe B, you don't believe not C? So various qualifications we could make, and we can talk about some of those later maybe. But if we're going to use something like BP or some variant on it to illuminate what it is for an argument to be valid, then we're going to need some kind of grasp on the right-hand side for the how we ought to reason. So you might say, so if you look at Broome's principle and you come at it with an account of what entails what, then it tells you how you ought to reason. But if we're trying to work out what the entailment relation amounts to, then the principle will only be useful if we've got some kind of independent grasp on the right-hand side what we ought to be doing in reasoning. So it's no good if you say how should we reason? We should use valid arguments. What are valid arguments? They're the ones we reason with. And since we're interested in basically something along the latter lines, characterising what valid arguments by what we should reason, then we're going to have some independent grip on the normative facts here. So, what should we? What line should we take there? One line that Field rejects quite quickly, that I don't want to say much about, is the thought that there are brute normative facts here about what you should be doing in reasoning. It talks about this as a normative realism, and it argues that it faces various metaphysical, epistemological, and awareness objections. Suppose we're putting that aside, how could we avoid that kind of realism and still hope to illuminate what's valid by thinking about normative? Well, one way we could go is to explain or reduce facts about how we should reason to facts about actual inferential behaviour. We think we generally reason well. Maybe we can extract an account of how we should reason by looking at how we do reason. Alternatively, we could offer something of an expressivist story, which is what Field calls his story. He thinks there isn't it's wrong to call norms correct or incorrect. To see people as expressing certain norms, expressing their commitment to certain inferential rules as it might be. So that kind of expressed the story. I think in some ways we can treat alongside the more reductionist story. Just a few general things about the suggestion that we understand validity by looking at how we actually reason and extracting some kind of picture. Clearly, we're going to need to idealise. They're accounting for the fact that people make mistakes in their reasoning, and that's going to generate various problems or challenges that I want to kind of leave in the background, really, when we come to look at more specific principles and suggestions. One general problem then here is that with this kind of methodology, you may end up with several systems that are equally good. You can generalize from the facts in various different ways. Maybe you prioritize a generality over simplicity, maybe you do the other way around, and given that we've got to allow for exceptions, things that count as bad reasoning. Count different sorts of cases as exceptions, so they could end up with various different systems that equally good at explaining the actual reasoning. Might then go for pluralism. I don't want to talk about it too much now. Another general problem is that you might find there's insufficient uniformity in the way people reason. Find details, even within a restricted group. If you're restrict enough to one person just to a short length of time, you might not get enough reasoning maybe in there to generalise from. Third thing, the general worry here, fairly natural one to come to mind, is that this kind of approach threatens to wrongly legitimate common fallacies. There's a way of reasoning that people often engage in that we often want to say are fallacious. Then how do we guarantee that those get? Why don't they just end up as part of the behaviour how that has to be explained? Think of the conjunction fallacy. This is where you get the description of this woman when she was a student, Linda, and she described, and you think clearly she's a feminist, etc. And then you get asked this question right now, 10 years later, is it more likely she's a banker or that she's a banker and a feminist? And most people tend to say the latter. It's more likely she's a banker and a feminist, and of course that's not. It can't be, a conjunction can't be more likely than one of its conjuncts. Well, that's the way we tend to reason. Why won't that get into the kind of behaviour that's reasoning behaviour that gets to decide what counts as how we should reason. Okay. And more generally, this kind of policy, we have to work out what kind of behaviour we're generalising over. It's not just when we're actually kind of formulating arguments, it's got to be how we adapt our beliefs in response to other evidence and beliefs, how do we exclude inductive reasoning, etc. So I think there are those various challenges we want to keep in the background. But I want to move on to introducing degrees of belief. So there are lots of things, of course, where we you're asked whether you believe them. You may say yes, but not be confident in that belief. It's natural to model that by saying maybe you have a partial belief or a degree of belief or a credence in it. And since we so much we believe we're not certain in, then this seems to be crucial when we're thinking about our belief states, our adapting our belief states, etc. We seem to have to allow for degrees of belief. Maybe vagueness gives a source for another reason to think about degrees of belief. Maybe if you've got somebody who's borderline tall, do you believe he's tall? Don't fully believe he's tall, don't believe he's not tall. Maybe you've got some kind of intermediate degree of belief in the statement that he's tall. So we do have these degrees of belief, and they play a crucial role in our reasoning and our adapting our beliefs. So we should have a story about those that both feeds into the story about how we should reason and the story about how we do reason, if we're trying to get from how we do reason to the story about how we should reason. So I think we need to have a principle that involves degrees of belief. So if you're just thinking about a one premise argument, the natural extension of something like BP is BPD on your handout. If A entails C, then you ought to believe C to at least a greater degree as you believe A. Okay? So if A entails C, whatever degree you believe A to, you should believe C to at least that much. And again, of course, you can adapt the degree of belief in A if you degree of belief in C. Leads you to do that. Okay, so that I think is a fairly natural generalization for one premise. When we have more than one premise, there are different ways to generalize there. I'm interested in the way Field generalizes, and I think that helps with thinking about the preface paradox. So here's the preface paradox, if you all know it. You've got an author who's done a lot of work on her book. She believes all of the assertions in her book, but in the preface she says something in my book is false. She's modest, she knows she's going to make a mistake somewhere. How that sounds like she's believing something or some things, all the sentences in the book. She knows they're all sentences in the book, and the conjunction of them all which follows from those she doesn't believe. How can that be? She knows that though she's very confident in each of them, she could have made a mistake. She can't identify where, but in each claim in her book, she has a very high degree of belief, but not certainty, a non-maximal degree of belief in each. And somehow there's each of those slight drop degrees of belief slightly less than one can add up to total lack of confidence in the conjunction of this enormous great conjunction. So that seems a good way for her to respond to this inconsistency between the claim of the case and all the individual claims by pointing out that she has a non-maximal or high degree of belief in each of the premises, the individual claims in the book. It seems plausibly what she should do, and plausibly decent story of maybe what she would do, what we would say. Introducing degrees of belief into the story allows us to say why she isn't at fault when she writes that sentence in the preface, and it suggests that the way to generalise from our one premise case involves this idea of the uncertainties being able to add up. So move on to section 5 and Field's principles. So he has these two central principles on the handout. D star. If it's obvious that A1 to AN together entail B, then one ought to impose the constraint that PB, the degree of belief which you believe, degree to which you believe B, is to be at least PA1 plus PAN minus N minus 1 in any circumstances in which A1 to AN is here. That's it. So what's going on there? Well, I think the way Milne summarises it under E there on the handout, maybe a little clearer. If it's obvious that the premises of a valid argument entail a conclusion, then one ought to impose the constraint that the uncertainty of the conclusion, which is 1 minus the degree of belief in it, is never greater than the sum of the uncertainties of the premises. So you've got that idea that the uncertainties, the extent to which you're less than fully committed to, can add up and contribute to the conclusion. So that's his principle D. That looks nicely similar to the result minus Adams and suggested by Dorothy Edgington, a probabilistic result about the uncertainties of conclusions in relation to the uncertainties of the premises in a valid argument, where Adams derives this assuming classical logic and assuming validity of necessary truth preservation. So we don't want to use their result to justify Field's normative principles, given that we're wanting to count them as non-classical logics and reject the equation of validity of necessary truth preservation. But that's his principle D star. Principle E, which is closely related, and he described as a recasting of D star, though it's not clear that closely related. E seems particularly useful for our purposes. E says, employing a logic L involves it being one's practice that when simple inferences A1 to AN tells B, licensed by the logic are brought to one's attention, one will normally impose the constraint that PB is to be at least PA1 to PAN minus N minus 1. So the thought is we can read off from somebody's behaviour and how they adapt their beliefs, what logics they're employing, by looking at in what case, how they allow their degrees of beliefs to sit. If they never allow degrees of belief in P and you could derive that they follow modus ponens because they never allow the degree of belief in Q to drop more than the degree of belief in P, degree of belief in Q. So it seems to be, as I say, useful for our purposes of working out what logic people are following, how to use principle A. These are the principles I'm going to be thinking about. They're not the only principles that could play this role, but I think a lot of the worries I'm going to raise carry over to other principles you might pose. So, what should we think about these principles? Well, first of all, the very general kind of challenges and problems that I kind of wanted to leave in the background in section 3 still don't go away. So the worry about wrongly legitimising current fallacies or getting conservative correct systems, etc. Principle E, introducing degrees of truth there doesn't seem to solve those problems. Before going on to some more specific problems. I want to say just briefly, and then we'll maybe talk about this more in discussion if people are up on their recent field, maybe more than me. So though he seems to often be promoting the kind of line I'm interested in here, and he says some things that maybe make him look like he shouldn't be exactly my target, in which case I partly want to say, well, I'm still interested in whether, in this general question, whether we can characterise validity through normativity. But one thing he says is that he doesn't, he defends or suggests a kind of primitivism about the concept of validity. So he doesn't want these principles to define validity, but they've got some kind of, well, he talks most recently about a non-definitional conceptual role. He thinks the essence of validity is normative, even though these principles don't actually define it. So maybe he's not trying to do exactly what I'm saying, but I think if he's still given his claims about the normative essence, etc., or if you think that these principles given maybe a necessary, not sufficient condition for validity, then some of the worries I want to raise, I think, still arise. Okay, so moving on to section 5b. Well, let me start with as on the handout, with two different kinds of cases where you might want to say slightly different things about the normative situation in each. Suppose you've got one of these cases where C follows from A and B by some quite complex argument, and you believe A and B. Are you not as you should be if by not believing C? Well, if you've just never given any thought to C, maybe C is some use-rate conjunction or something, you've never given any thought, you neither believe it nor its negation, maybe we should say that's okay. Whereas if you actually believe the negation of C, then you're not as you should be and you should adapt your beliefs. You might want to distinguish those cases. That if you've not got the degrees of belief and you're in a non-degree theoretic framework, then that seems like something you can do. We can have a principle that requires that you don't believe the premises in negation to conclusions, say, rather than that you don't believe the premises without believing the conclusions. And I think that's quite an appealing way to go. But the situation gets much more complex when we start thinking about degrees of belief. What are we to say about cases where you haven't given much thought to C? Or do we say that you have some degree of belief in it anyway? It's the kind of case of uncertainty. So maybe if you haven't not thought about C, you have. Maybe we should say that ascribe your degree of belief of 0.5 in that. So one way to go when we're introducing the degree of belief framework is to say that the subject always has some degree of belief in a proposition. When there's uncertainty, we represent that with intermediate degrees of belief. And in other contexts, that might be a good way to go. But I want to say in this kind of context, it's not when we've got the kind of project in mind that I'm interested in. If what do we say about the degree of belief in these senses people haven't thought about? Well, we don't want to give them always say the degree of belief 0.5. That really doesn't seem right. That seems to misrepresent uncertainty. Suppose you've got your subject S who has a higher degree of belief in P, higher degree of belief in Q, and never actually wondered about P and Q can join them together. You don't want to say they have degree of belief half in that. That just seems kind of unfair to them. Reasonable to think to attribute that subject a high degree of belief in P and Q. But why is that reasonable? If we take that as reasonable based on the logical relations that P and Q follows from P and Q, then we're building the result about the patterns of degrees of belief with valid arguments into the data we're supposed to be trying to use to determine what arguments are valid or are taken to be valid. So we can't, if that's our general policy, in this kind of case, subject S believes P, believes being to a high degree of Q to a high degree of, so we must say they believe P and Q to a high degree. Well, why we can't then take this as evidence that they followed conjunction introduction, because we're assuming that in attributing the degrees of belief. If we're going to attribute degrees of belief in all cases, I think it's hard to know how we can do that without assuming what we're trying to be getting a grip on. The second option is to allow a subject can have no degree of belief in some proposition. So we can allow a kind of uncertainty that doesn't get represented with a particular degree of belief. If you've just never given any thought to C, maybe we should say just not ascribe you any to C. Then we might qualify a principle, as Field says, a principle governing a person's degree of belief ought to be understood as having the tacit assumption that the person has all the degrees of belief in question. So let's write that qualification into Field's principle E, giving EQ on the handout. Employing the logic L involves it being one's practice that when simple inference B, license of a logical organization, one will normally impose a degree, if one has all the degrees of belief in question. Okay. So, it might be a more promising way to go, but I think it's problematic in other ways. I think it brings out a general problem with the use of degrees of belief in the particular context I'm talking about, trying to read off stuff about what logic people follow, etc., by looking at their degrees of belief. And the general problem is about whether we, it's kind of a problem about whether we really have such precise degrees of belief, or what kind of degrees of belief we actually have. And in a few cases we might explicitly formulate a degree of belief, but obviously that's going to be very rare. So when do you count as having a degree of belief in the proposition, not only when you've explicitly formulated it? We've got to extrapolate in some way, but what kind of way? Again, you're going to meet this problem that we're going to be tempted to extrapolate in a way that assumes the logical principles. Give a subject earlier who hadn't thought about P and Q but had a high degree of belief in P and Q. It's natural to attribute them a degree of belief, but that we can't do that. I think, do we have a rich enough specifiable pattern of degrees of belief to be able to do this heavy work of extrapolating around what the logical principle? More generally, you might think using numerical degrees of belief is too much of an idealization for the purposes at hand, so perfectly fine for some other purposes, but if we're looking at our subject and wanting to read off how they're from these degrees of belief, they've got to have, we can't just be, we've got to be careful with how we idealize. And we do need proper numerical degrees of belief. We can't just think that they fall on an ordinal scale where the kind of comparative judgment, how comparative judgment between P and Q, if you think P, you're more inclined to stick to P than Q, then you've got a higher degree of belief in Q, but we don't have to worry about the exact numerical value. That might be kind of a tempting way to go, except with principles like Field, we're interested in summing values of these uncertainties, degrees of belief. So we need to have actual numerical value. An ordinal scale won't do there. So I think this is a general worry about using this framework in the way that we're considering here. So moving on to section C, I'm just thinking a bit more about the principle E in relation to classical logics. So if he's going to work to show that somebody employs a logic other than classical logic, well, that's one thing we should be doing. And one general worry here is that you can have a subject who rejects a classical inference from gamma to C without actually having a lower degree in C than the principle requires, because they don't want to conclude that C, maybe they withhold any degree of belief in C, which then by the qualification we had in a field excludes that as a counterexample. So as an example, some relevant theorists reject disjunction introduction. You can't conclude A or B from A if B is irrelevant to it. Suppose you're wanting to reject that rule. It might, when B is relevant in some cases, then you are happy to conclude A or B from A. But when in the other cases where B isn't relevant in the relevant respects, then you silent on whether A or B is not. That it is true or not. That's the kind of case where you just don't adopt a degree of belief in A or B. But then that seems to mean you don't meet the conditions to be a counterexample to following that rule according to EQ. So that's a worry there. Next, just relatively briefly, I think, for the sake of time, just thinking about another kind of non-classical logic, many value logic. So suppose maybe for reasons of vagueness or some other reason we want truth values between truth and falsity, maybe a whole spectrum, maybe thinking of them as degrees of truth. In those kinds of frameworks, there are lots of different definitions of validity on offer, and I alluded to some of those earlier. I don't want to go through them all here. One of the options, again, I alluded to earlier, Field calls weak validity, which is to say that an argument is valid if and only if whenever the premises have value 1, the top value, and so does the conclusion. That's what Field suggests, the account of validity there. But I think that doesn't look, well, it's not clear that's relevant there, because you might think validity should qualify what degrees of belief you have in the conclusion given the intermediate degree of the premises. But so putting that aside, so suppose you're going for a weak validity, the definition of validity in a many value theory, and you also take quite a natural, though far from universal, line that what degree of belief you should have in P corresponds to the degree of truth that P has. That's the degree of belief you should have. So when you've got the borderline case, tech is tall, is truth degree 0.8. What degree of belief should you have in tech is tall? Well, 0.8. So suppose you think that, then weak validity is problematic in this for the principles. So it dictates that if some premises entail C, we shouldn't. We shouldn't. This is what I just said. Really, if some premises entail C, then you shouldn't fully believe the premises without believing C. But there seems to be no constraint on what belief in C is when belief in one of the premises is even slightly less than 1, and that seems you seem to need such constraints, and anyone adopting such a logic will impose such constraints. Consider the argument P, therefore definitely P. So you're thinking tech who's 0.8 tall, well, he's not definitely tall, it's a borderline case. But according to weak validity, that argument is valid because he's not tall to degree 1. So there's no, so it's not going to be a counterexample. But yet, if so on the handout here we've got Tim who's thin to degree 0.5. So suppose Tim's thin to degree 0.5, your degree of belief in Tim is thin should be 0.5. But what do you think about Tim is definitely thin? Well, you've got a much lower degree of belief in that. So you seem to have there what your theory would tell you should have a lower degree of belief, but you seem to be violating Field's principle D star, which would tell you, given the argument's valid, you should have a higher degree of belief. But I think this is a perfectly consistent, reasonable position, logical position you take. You adopt a many-valued logic, this common definition of validity, and this common line on the relation between degree of belief and degree of truth. But you can't count as adopting that logic according to Field's E. So again, Field's principle seems to fail to capture, seems to fail to have this neutrality and fail to capture how you reason if you're not reasoning in a certain restrictive way, classically. So it seems it doesn't seem to allow for advocating employing these various options, genuine options for many valued logics. So just to sum up at the end then, I think his principles don't have that kind of required neutrality. I don't think such neutrality is available. We can't have a general normative story of how you should act that works for any logical system we might adapt. I think, yeah, maybe there's always going to be some normative story for some given logical system. We could tell a story about that many valued theories we were thinking about, but it's not that they're not having normative constraints given their logical system. It's that it's a somewhat different story. And I think so. I think that we can't expect to get a normative principle that tells us what we should do with logic, with valid arguments, and then get a grip on what this choice between this broad range of alternative logics without begging the question. I think in choosing logics, we've got to thinking about the normative principles would have some kind of a role, but it's kind of part of this whole package deal that tells you the whole story about the logical system. So I think normative considerations can't be the key to characterizing validity or to selecting between different logics.
So questions, if you keep your hand up, I'll put you on there.
Yeah, many thanks. So, off my head, I mean, if your argument is correct, then it would generalize the thing. So suppose I'm a differentialist who thinks that admissible logical rules should satisfy certain theoretic strictures, and so theoretic requirements. Admissible logical system should satisfy global requirements, and I've got a philosophical story to tell about these theoretic requirements, and I don't pin down exactly one logic because perhaps I pin down a family of operational rules, but then it's indeterminate which structural rules we're going to adopt on this view. But surely I'm going to rule out some things as unacceptable. And so I wonder whether you may be a bit too ecumenic because you say, well, you're ruling out too much, so we can't. So proof theory cannot be a tool for understanding what logic is and for understanding what consequence is. And so I wonder whether perhaps we to return to degrees of beliefs and normative considerations, perhaps we can have philosophical motivations for understanding degrees of the normative force of validity in a certain way, and that's going to rule out some things that just don't fall out of the picture.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, there's no, yeah, I agree that we've got to allow for story that rules out some options, having the kind of approach you talk about. Clearly, it seems fine, so that it's not compatible with certain options. But you've got to have a good story for why that's the right approach. You've got to be able to justify. You can, and you have plenty to say to justify that kind of inferentialism. But I think so. The question is whether they feel says or can say enough to just say, oh yeah, no, my story tells me that those options aren't fair. And I think it doesn't say enough. The principle is justified by saying, well, it does work nicely for the classical case. But does that show that that's what role validity has? Have I done anything to rule out those cases by saying if it doesn't follow this principle that works for my role? No, because you need to show why that's a good principle. And now that's sounding a bit kind of ad hominem. He's not saying enough about that. But I think there's no. I think when you think about these alternative logical positions, say the many-valued one at the end, I think there's a perfectly reasonable normative story you can tell there. You can tell if you adopt this logic, this is how you should adapt your degrees of belief. That's perfectly reasonable, and that can be combined with a story about validity. And it seems to me that's fine. You've met some kind of loose normative requirement, something about, and but if that's fine, then that's another way you can go. It's another principle. We haven't got any grip on deciding between these by thinking about the normative. So if, like in the inferentialist case, if we could get this motivation for this exact principle and then rule out some of the options, that's fine. But I think that's not clear that we can.
Like that, I agree with a lot of it, but it did seem to me that your conclusion, your last sentence, just seemed to be far too strong. Normative considerations can't be the key to, forget about characterizing, selecting between different logics. And I can't see how one could possibly raise the question, should I accept intuitionist logic or classical logic or relevant logic or whatever? Just seems like a normative question, right? Yeah. It may well be that the particular, you might very well be right that the particular machinery that field is using, although I think it's ever so important when you're thinking about uncertainty, and it might be when you're thinking about these things, that it doesn't answer the question. But it's got to be a normative question, isn't it? And so,
okay, thank you. I think I'm just going to say that, I think what I meant by it was the key to thing. That's the thing that leap out to me in that sentence. But even then, but now, given what you said, even now that sounds maybe too strong. So, I definitely want to shut that talk down. Everyone can scribble that sentence on. That'd be good. I think they are. You're absolutely right, of course, that the normative considerations have got to be crucial, and I want them to be crucial. I think, but I think they shouldn't. I think there's no simple. There's not going to be a simple principle which we can use. So I think I would just go back to what I said earlier. So I'm talking about the specifics that I've overstated much. Thanks.
Yes, this is really implications. But when bringing up the issue of whether numerical degrees of belief may be too much of an idealisation, say, well, we can't just get by with an ordering of beliefs, we need to sum them. It seems like that might be a bit too quick, because it might be that given any, if agents do only really have an ordering of beliefs of what they're more certain and what they're less certain, it might be that whenever we represent those with numerically, if it always turns out that however we numerically represent them, the ordering of sums of them works out the same, then it looks like that's still going to be able to do the job of the Field's principles. So you don't actually need to have agents having precise degrees of belief. If however you represent those orderings of beliefs numerically, you get the same answer.
Yeah, thanks. That sounds right. Yeah. Okay. So I haven't got a reason to think that it won't be the case that however you will get. So they can still fit the pattern for different potential orderings. That's correct. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a problem with thinking that there is this ordinal ordering anyway, because I don't think have you got a stronger belief in Tekistor or Tennant's then when they're both kind of around the borderline? I think but that is an idealisation to think there is one there, and if you allow the different possible orderings to check. So if your thought is because you represent different groups in different ways, but they're all it's normal scale, they all match up. But I think it doesn't even. It's an idealisation to think it's even the ordinal scale. Well, that's obviously a slightly different point, but yeah, I take your point. Yeah.
Yeah, so just a simple point about principle E and undefined credences. So I thought that, so principle E says employing logic involves being less practiced than when simple inferences, license with logic, are brought to one's attention, one will normally impose certain constraints on degrees of belief. And so you worry that this might not make room for cases where, or might not allow us to distinguish, to say the right thing about cases where the subject hasn't considered the question, but I would have thought, I mean, I don't know if Field's original paper, but I would have thought that there's a way of reading this principle in which basically what it's suggesting is just one simple test where one brings the inference to the attention of the subject and says, okay, consider this inference, for example, A, B, hence A and B. And so I would have thought that in that circumstance, the subject is kind of presented with the occasion of kind of considering, for example, the conjunction, right? And so I would have thought that, in your case, even if one starts out with a certain degree of belief in A, a certain degree of belief in B, but doesn't have a defined degree of belief in the conjunction, then when the test is performed, when I go to the person and say, okay, consider A, B, hence A and B, thumbs up or not, then that gives the person a chance to kind of consider the conjunction, right? And so decide, make up their mind about what they're going to do about their degrees of belief about the conjunction. So I would have thought that the way that Field poses, the way that Field puts the condition, in a way, kind of shields ourselves from the worry about credences that might be originally undefined, because in a way it's something like, seems to me something like a test. If you ask somebody about the inference, are they willing or not to impose this constraint, but by asking them somehow you make them consider the question, right? And so I thought maybe there is a reply to that specific worry.
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, I have to. Yeah, I have to think about that. Yeah, I mean, this isn't supposed that tackles that specific problem rather than say the one about the worry I had about the relevant theories disjunction. Because if you got, I mean, in those cases we're thinking. Sorry, I'm thinking that they may just not want to accept the disjunction, but not. Yeah, you're thinking more. You're thinking my earlier point about when I'm saying what degree of belief do we ascribe them in that case, and the thought is, well, we could just look at the situation where we present these things to them, and then I shouldn't be thinking kind of, oh, we've got to start off and looking at their what degrees of belief they've got and present these questions to them.
Right, I thought that the two points were related because I thought that the worry involving the relevance theorist example derived from the fact that you have to weaken Field's condition E. to make room for undefined credences. So the thought is maybe we can keep condition E as it is, and then the worry is not going to arise because essentially the relevance test is going to fail the test.
Yeah, but the problem then is we can't have, I mean, we've got such limited kind of data to work on what they're employing. It looks like it's only when we're kind of actually presenting, it's only when we're kind of quizzing them that we'll get that they employing the logic. The thought was well, yeah, we should be able to read it off from what they do. We're not only worried about what philosophers do, we can go about the questions. So that's why I thought that the qualification was needed, because we want to be able to look at when they, even if we're not just in a limited case where we're presenting them.
I see, I thought Field was just giving a necessary condition. Like, it seems he says, employing a logic involves, among other things, like this clearly has to be the case, just as a sort of like, okay, the minimal test is going to be this, or maybe there's going to be more. I agree with you that maybe, that's not going to be the only thing.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, so this is a question about the dialectic, and I'm a little unclear about why the counterexample is supposed to tell against both D star and E. It seems to me, it's really clear to me, and I think completely convincing that it is a counterexample.
So you mean which counterexample do you have in mind?
The case of the inference from P to definitely P.
Okay, right, yeah.
I am right that that's supposed to tell against both.
In a sense, yes. Can we carry on and then I can say more about it?
Okay, so I mean, I think it's a completely persuasive counterexample to E. In that it's a situation where someone employs a logic. It's the case that according to that logic an inference is valid, and given the logic that that person employs, they're rationally justified in having credences that don't match the constraint. But E nowhere involves the notion of validity. It only involves the notion of validity according to the logic that the person employs. And that's completely uncontroversial. I mean, but in the case of D, it seems to me that, D is supposed to be a constraint on actual validity. So it's only going to be a counterexample if that inference is really valid and those credences are really rationally acceptable. And so I'm not sure why Field wouldn't just deny that and say, well, look, the criterion's doing exactly what it's supposed to. It's shown us that this conception of validity and these assumptions about rational credences are not co-tenable. And that's good. It's given us some information. It's ruled out one option.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. I going back to did I intend it as a counterexample to both E and D star, and it was mainly E I was concerned with, but I think so. But is it? But you're right. You're quite right that if we take D star as telling us how we ought to reason, and that and we kind of start off with the assumption that there's some class of valid arguments, then D star, some logical system that's wrong, no matter how appealing, isn't going to be a problem for that principle. Yeah, so that's right. That's not how Field wants to use it. He has this kind of expressivism about logic. So he wants to allow for. He talks about a relativist expressivism.